What role did Henry George, the land value tax, and Georgism have in the development of modern liberalism? Chris England is a lecturer at Georgetown University and author of the new book, Land and Liberty, Henry George and the Crafting of Modern Liberalism. He joins us today for the first of a two-part series on Georgism and land value taxes. The second episode, next week, will focus on modern land value taxes. There are pluses and minuses and the best potential technocratic ways to implement them. But this week's episode, the first in the series, will focus on the history of Georgism. We'll talk about how it influenced liberalism and why it was so influential for a time before it died out as a movement. As always, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to the podcast. If you really like us, you can support us by becoming a member at patreon.com/Neoliberal Podcast. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Chris England. Chris is a lecturer at Georgetown University and is the author of the new book, Land and Liberty, about Henry George and his place in American political history and how Henry George and his followers influenced liberalism, and that's the topic of today's show. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess I want to start out with just kind of a basic question about Henry George and kind of by extension his followers. Can he be contextualized in terms of modern politics? Because right now we sit on a very kind of left-right political spectrum, and we think about things, you know, there's liberal versions of certain parties and illiberal versions. How would you classify Henry George? Was he a conservative in some ways? Was he pointed towards the left? Was he a liberal? Was he something else entirely?
George is hard to categorize, and that is one of the things I found fascinating about him, in that he is, drawn to what we would call classical liberalism. He believes fervently in the free market, but he also believes that there are certain types of property, particularly land, but other types of natural monopolies as well, that are inherently social in character and could serve as the foundation through taxation of a social welfare state that would be consistent with the ideas of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. So in some ways, you see his influence in incipient libertarianism through people like Albert J. Nock. You also see his influence in more left-wing liberals like John Dewey. And I find him fascinating precisely because he is able to bridge this divide. But I think that this is not as unusual as we might see it today. I think it represents a tradition of liberalism that always was critical of certain types of property, and was never as gung-ho about the market as we see it today. Always had certain types of reservations about the market.
It's very interesting for me because in some ways, Henry George is very right-wing coded, but in other ways, he's very left-wing coded. Like, as you mentioned, he's very much libertarian in a lot of ways, huge advocate of the free market. And he kind of had this thing about like the collective unconscious or something like that, which was very much a restatement of kind of the invisible hand of the market and that idea. And he very much was like the government should get out of most things. But at the same time, he was like for full nationalization of land and resources and almost socialization of those things.
Yeah, his idea of a collective unconsciousness, I would look at this less as like the invisible hand and more like Milton Friedman's pencil analogy. The idea that no one person could create a pencil at this point in history because that process has been divided up amongst so many people and so many actors. The resources come from all over the world. And what George argues is that inherent in market processes is a collective unconsciousness. And like I said, this reiterates or builds upon ideas that seem conservative in their iteration when they're iterated by people like Milton Friedman. But at the same time, they embody the idea that there is something cooperative to market processes. But it's also in some ways a critique of the market, insofar as he's arguing that the market should be cooperative, that it should be a place in which people receive rewards in proportion to their exertion and proportions to what they put into a collective good, but it's not. And it's not primarily because of various types of rent. Ways in which monopolies allow the prices of goods to be skewed, particularly land, and to allow for the monopolization of natural resources, of transit, of railways, of communications networks. And because of these types of monopolies, a process that should be collaborative and consensual and egalitarian instead becomes exploitative.
It's very interesting how he was kind of at the forefront of what you might call today welfare state capitalism. And certainly he was not the first person, I don't think, to have ever had this idea, but he was one of the more important proponents of it. And his spin on it was very unique because a lot of kind of welfare state development was very much, historically it seemed like an interest group or a class of people kind of advocating for what they wanted, and not so much based on theory of what a government should be, but based on, well, we're going to fight you until we get this. And in the end, it ends up being a positive thing that the welfare state developed this way. But at the beginning, it was more like, well, I want this. Whereas George kind of put some theoretical underpinnings to like, take this thing that we believe, land is this kind of unearned privilege that people have, and take that and, use it to fund development, and especially urban developments, which was unique for him at the time, right?
Yeah, there were not many Americans during this period who would be described as urbanist, and I think not surprisingly so, because cities were places that were, literally full of manure and full of disease.
Well, and most people didn't live in cities, to be fair. We didn't live in the urbanized society that we have today. Most people were still rural, and like half the country was still employed as farmers or something like that.
Yeah, the overwhelming majority of Americans were farmers. They saw cities as places of vice and inequality and corruption. They associated it with immigrants who they perceived as unfit for democracy. George came in and argued for a welfare state and for the development of cities at a time in which welfarism was really had a minimal role in American political thought. You do see urban machines like Tammany Hall that are distributing aid to immigrants on the basis largely of the fact that they will vote for them.
There's a kind of like very quid pro quo or tit for tat nature to a lot of how the welfare state developed, at least in certain instances. Whereas it seemed to me that George had a much more interesting and much more theoretical, like, this is the theory for why you should want to spend on welfare state style projects.
And the thing is that for George, it's not even a question of spinning. It's a question of entitlement. Because what he argues is that the value of a city doesn't belong to anyone. If the reason that, a block of land in Manhattan costs millions upon millions of dollars is not because the person who owns it has made it so. It's because there is an entire city around it. There are workers who, man transit lines who make this a vital point of communication. There are, people with shops around the corner that make it an attractive place to have lunch. There are people who are fixing up their houses to make it a nice neighborhood. The value of land in general, and particularly urban land, is, according to George, created by society in general and created by the community. And George turns to John Locke. John Locke says that we have a right to ourselves and a right, therefore, to the things that we create. And if the community as a whole creates something, George argues, that means the community has a right to it. And so what you see is an idea that land is a sort of communal good that belongs to all people, that the community has a collective property right to it. And based off of that, you have a fund that can be used for things like social welfare. And so, this is in stark contrast to, urban regimes that are clientelist, that are building political power based off of welfare. It's arguing essentially for liberalizing welfare, taking a process that most Americans see as corrupt, and instead organizing it around an idea of individual and collective rights to communal goods.
Now, most people who are listening to this podcast are probably not Georgists. They're probably not land value tax people. That's a very small but dedicated community. But most people are may have heard of this, they may have heard of Henry George, but they would not consider themselves like dedicated Georgists or anything like that. And so I think it's a fair question when we think about all this stuff to ask, how important was Henry George in American political history? And, it's a valid question to ask because at this point, Georgism is not a big political force. It has not been a big political force in my lifetime or even in my parents' lifetime, probably. And, we may know Henry George as, well, he was this guy. He thought that we should tax the value of land. And there's some solid economic theory behind why that's a good thing to do. There's no deadweight loss if you want to talk in economics terms. But okay, what does that even mean? He's a guy who had a theory. Why should I care about him? So how important was Henry George actually during kind of that period when his ideas gained prominence?
So he is broadly influential. His books are some of the best-selling books of the period. He forms a social movement that's very effective at winning power in urban areas.
And about what time period are we talking here?
So his books are becoming very popular in the 1870s to the turn of the 20th century. And by the beginning of the 20th century, they have a powerful base in American cities. They go on to have administrative positions in the Wilson administration. So and they help to shift a lot of urban areas to the Democratic Party. More broadly, they lay the foundation for a number of the more successful policies of the New Deal, policies that would focus on the socialization of natural resources like the Tennessee Valley Authority and other policies like a leasehold system for the public domain that are today very essential to environmental management. More broadly, what they do is they provide a way to rationalize a more expansive social welfare state within the rubric of liberalism. During the same period, you have a lot of people, particularly progressive academics, who begin to feel like the ideas that had animated the Civil War, ideas of rights and equality, were outdated and were instead looking to places like Germany for ideas that were tinged with authoritarian nationalism, that called for eugenics, that called for elite and expert control of all elements of the American economy. George offers an alternative for thinking about the ways in which you can reconcile ideas of rights and individualism with a collectivist social welfare state. And in that way, he sort of lays a lot of the intellectual groundwork for the liberalism of the New Deal.
I want to pick up on something you said there because it's a pathway I'd love to chase down. And it was when you mentioned progressives. And I think obviously that means something different than what progressive means today. But the progressive movement was a force and the perhaps the very late 1800s, and certainly the 1900s and 1910s and so forth. And it's very interesting to me, as someone kind of steeped in modern politics, to hear about the birth of the kind of air quotes progressive movement, which is loosely associated with the progressive movement today, but believed very different things. Can you do a little bit of compare and contrast? Because I'd love to talk about how liberalism of that day contrasted with progressivism.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's also a squishy one because these terms don't necessarily have definite meanings. There was never a convention at which people came together and defined what progressivism was. But in terms of, how people tended to identify and, kind of the loose association with these terms, progressivism would often be more strongly associated with the ideas of a kind of native-born, upper middle class, educated, often very strongly associated with the university system, very confident in the power of educated experts to exercise influence in society. But also very much reacting against ideas that they felt had in the post-Civil War era created a period of corporate dominance. The Civil War was fought over ideas like freedom of contract, property rights in a lot of ways. Capitalism looked like a benevolent alternative to slavery.
Well, I mean, we should be clear what particular property rights the Civil War was fought over.
Well,
one set of property rights above others.
Yes, the Civil War was clearly opposed to, Northerners were opposed to property in slaves, by and large. But Northerners embraced an idea of the free market as a alternative to slavery. And the post-Civil War Republican Party, fed into corporate consolidation with subsidies to major industries, a focus on industrial development. And so many progressives reacted against ideas of individualism and rights and looked instead towards ideas of ideas that were collectivist in various ways. Often they pulled on Catholic ideas of corporate identity and the idea that society was some sort of coherent organism. It was a single species, and each part of the society served a particular role. This embodies a certain type of social unity. It also embodies social hierarchy because the workers were the hands, the experts were the head.
This is almost like the beginnings of what you might call managerialism or like scientism, kind of this belief that if we put society in the hands of the experts, like experts should manage everything, they should run our corporations, that, science should dictate policy and things like that. And that was very much in vogue at kind of the turn of the century and the beginning of the 1900s, right?
Yeah, yes, there was a profound faith in experts and an aspiration that experts could be used to revolutionize society. And this segues directly into many of the corporate ideals of the time. Taylorism, this idea that professionals can manage business to closely manage workers in particular, to put them on a stopwatch and experiment with them to see exactly how they should move to do their job. This was an idea that was widely embraced by progressives as consistent with their idea of social progress and efficiency, even though it was often resented by workers who saw their autonomy being undermined by professional management and very close and restrictive oversight.
And I think this ends up going from reasonable ideas like, okay, we should trust scientific experts. That seems like a pretty good thing. and certainly Taylor and that kind of managerial oversight, that has its victories. There's a lot of good ideas in there that did actually make people more efficient. But it ended up with progressives of that day ending up supporting things that I think progressives today would be horrified by. Things like eugenics and the idea that some people are just naturally meant to be over other people, and imperialism and ideas like that.
Yeah, and many progressives would look back at this period with regret as one in which they embraced an idea of science that was unscientific. Eugenics laws are passed by most states. George is, a critic of this trend, and many of his leading supporters are, very critical of it. And because of that, they've often been branded as populist. But I push back against that and argue that, in fact, they do embrace expertise insofar as it is subject to the public, rather than the idea that experts should be making public policy. They should be executing the policy that voters support. And they embrace a pretty classically liberal view of the way in which open discourse and democracy should guide policy, rather than having self-appointed experts in charge of everything.
Now, I think it's a fair question to ask, because now most people back in those days were racist and sexist to some degree. That was just the world that they lived in. And, if you judge them by modern standards, you're probably going to end up calling 99.9% of them racist. And it's good that, society's gotten better on this stuff. But I would love to ask about George's views and his followers' views on this kind of stuff. When it comes to eugenics or when it comes to imperialism, were they actually any better than kind of their contemporaries, or were they kind of the same as everybody else, kind of saying some of the same things? Were they actually upholding what we would identify as liberal ideals?
Yeah, I think that is one of the more interesting conclusions that comes out of this book. Obviously, the movement is not free of racism, and there are segments of it that, particularly in California, that remain highly racist. And that's hard to avoid during the period in which racial inequality and racial differences are so deeply encoded. So I don't ever claim that they're anti-racist, but like the abolitionists, who also had many problems concerning race, they are looking to create a more racially egalitarian society in many ways. So they protest segregation. Lewis Post, who becomes the lead writer of the movement after Henry George dies, is someone who's been involved in efforts to reconstruct the South, and has subsequently become a supporter of the NAACP, argues for civil rights quite consistently. The movement often integrates people of color in various ways into the cause. And I think that this is rooted in the fact that the movement draws directly off of abolitionism. William Lloyd Garrison II, for example, is a supporter of the movement and a leader within the movement. It appeals to the old abolitionist ideas of freedom of contract while modernizing them to embrace solutions to inequality within a capitalist economy. So whereas many progressives are just turning away from these ideas of civil rights and individualism towards an idea of collective difference, single taxers and Georgists are instead trying to modernize those ideas. And they challenge ideas like imperialism. They are consistent critics of imperialism, even looking towards oftentimes something like what would be the United Nations as a place for collective discussion of world problems.
One of the most interesting through lines of the book is the idea that Henry George was kind of vital to liberalism, and either you could argue developing liberalism into somewhat of its modern form, or saving liberalism during an era when the future of liberalism was potentially in doubt. That's something that I'm really, really interested in as kind of a student of liberalism and of the history of liberalism. Can you make your case why Henry George saved liberalism?
Okay, I should begin by saying that this is actually not an entirely original innovation. The British historian Michael Freeden has argued much the same about the way in which George helped create a new liberalism in England that helped to transition liberalism into the future. But there hadn't before this been any study that found a similar impact of Henry George in the United States. And so, I think crucially, as I mentioned before, progressives are bringing forth ideas that emphasize nationalism and in some ways move away from ideas of democracy. Georgists help popularize an alternative, and they do that in part by realizing these ideas in practice in cities. You have people like Mayor Tom Johnson of Cleveland, who fights a very public campaign for land value taxation and for ultimately public ownership of the streetcar line in that city. And he becomes a model for urban reform. But I think more than that, he and many of his allies, like the muckraker Lincoln Steffens, are showing that the people who progressives consider the best people, the educated, native-born, that they think should sort of would be better governing these situations than urban immigrants. That many of these native-born Americans were in fact just as corrupt as the immigrants that the progressives saw as undermining American democracy.
This was definitely, I think, for me, the biggest treat reading the book and the most fascinating thing. Just to kind of get this through line of liberalism, because again, it's a topic I love to think about, love to talk about, the history of how liberalism developed. And the idea that Henry George was, relatively accepting of immigrants for the time, a free trader, somebody who believed in the power of markets, but then also wanted to, in modern economic terms, kind of tax things that deserve to be taxed, where there's no deadweight loss. It really speaks to kind of a modern sensibility to me, and it's really fascinating. I'm curious if you also have any thoughts on how this would link into kind of the neoliberal development a few decades after this, because we are an ideological podcast, right? This is called the Neoliberal Podcast, and we try not to hide that. I feel like it's better to just be openly ideological than to hide it and admit that you've got a bias, which I do. But I've always been fascinated by the neoliberals who in the 1930s and 40s, they were trying to respond very consciously to what they thought were threats to liberalism, right? They had literal Nazi fascism in Europe, and they had Stalinist communism, and they looked at the world and they said, liberalism has got to develop itself if it's going to respond to these threats, if liberalism is going to survive. And so that's why they developed kind of new liberalism. They thought a more modern form, a better suited for the modern world. I'm curious if you see any commonalities there or any connecting links between kind of Henry George's protection of liberalism or development of liberalism, however you want to say that, and the developments that would take place a few decades later.
Yeah, I think the continuities are in a realization that there are certain kind of core liberal values in things like freedom of speech and democracy and some degree of market organization that need to be reconciled with the idea of a proactive state that will ensure that welfare is sufficient to social welfare is such that society will remain stable and people won't look to alternatives to liberalism for order, prosperity, and security. And so George, I think, clearly anticipates and is a model for that. And also, of course, George is a free trader, and so he, he looked ultimately towards a modern era of globalization and internationalism. The movement was always tinged with elements of internationalism, but at the same time, he understood the potential shortcomings. Particularly, he said that land was the robber that takes all that is left, and so you eliminate one type of monopoly, and a lot of the benefits are going to accrue to land. That as prosperity increases, there will be progressively more demand on a finite supply of resources and urban space. And of course, this is what we've seen in a globalized economy with rising resource prices as prosperity has increased demand, and also with the development of what are called global cities. Places where of intense specialization and market and physical infrastructure that make them extremely optimal for certain types of production, but also mean that the space underneath is so incredibly valuable that it becomes an obstacle to equality, and in many cases an obstacle to production, as rising housing costs make it progressively more difficult to maintain profitable industries in even in tech in Silicon Valley, where rising prices are make the cost of living obscenely high.
So I'd love to shift for a second, and I want to talk about some of the potential shortcomings of George's thought and Georgism. And, you're not Henry George, obviously, but I'm going to make you answer for him to some extent.
Happy to.
But it's just, it strikes me that there are some potential criticisms of the Henry George mindset and the single tax as a political movement. And I'm just curious whether you think they are legitimate criticisms or what they're overblown, or whether there's, good responses to them. One of the most important criticisms that I've seen is that Georgism is kind of this all or nothing ideology, and that it's a little bit of a totalizing ideology, in that this is the only thing you need. This is all that is required to make society a utopia. And I have not read Henry George's books entirely. I've read passages, but he does get caught up in saying things like, the single tax will stop wars, will end disease, it will eliminate poverty and make sure that everyone has a job, and science is flourishing, and it basically solves every problem. And you listen to his stump speeches. Do you think that's a fair characterization, that Georgism is almost a little cult-like in how totalizing it is?
There is an element of that. George and some of his leading supporters like Louis Post, did try to combat something of a tendency in the movement to reducing everything to the single tax. They argued that the single tax was not a panacea, it was a fundamental reform, in that if all types of progress ultimately create increased demand for land and increase land prices and rent, then the only way you can establish effective reforms elsewhere is to do something about rising land rents. You can't give people money to buy houses if when they go and buy houses, it's just going to push up the value of houses. And so that is a way of...
It's funny you say that, because California, I just read about a program where they pumped $300 million into this program to help 2,300 home buyers. And they didn't build any new houses. They just helped people buy houses, but they're just shifting it from one person to another. They're not actually helping anything.
Yeah, and I do talk about this in the book, that liberalism reaches this juncture in the New Deal where New Dealers realized that low prices, everything being underwater, is a major contributor to the depression, and so they decided to pump money into markets to increase prices. And the result is that you have all of these programs to support the buying of housing, but as a consequence, houses have only increased in price over time. And this has created a society based off of inherited wealth in a lot of ways that's decreased social mobility. And so this was maybe a rational choice at the time, but I think it's come to be a problem. And going back to the question of totalizing, because it is true, definitely, that Georgists were ideological, who saw everything as related to land in some capacity. And I'm not on board with that. And many people who were, in some ways part of or sort of on the periphery of this were not quite there. You have people like John Dewey, a prominent American philosopher who embraces many of these ideas, but is also far more eclectic in terms of the way he thinks about social problems. But I don't necessarily see it as entirely a detriment. I think there is some value in in American politics, or politics more broadly, to ideology. I think that one of the reasons why Democrats and liberals have often struggled in American politics in recent decades is that they are unable to articulate a clear vision of what their endpoint is, what their better society is, or to have a clearly structured sense for what their political platform is. And so ideology is something that can guide mass movements. I think that by structuring his movement ideologically, and I think George did this quite intentionally, he was trying to build coalitions around a precise idea. He saw around him a set of reform movements that were disconnected, that represented individual interests, that didn't, that all had problems, but didn't have necessarily a clear solution. And he tried to build a system of thought that intentionally appealed to all of them. And I think was more effective politically because of it. And, personally, I have my doubts about that. And I think in some ways many people in the movement did. They understood that this way of thinking was not always perfect, but they also saw it as vital to the way the movement was constructed politically.
I think a lot of people, if they read this book, will be surprised to the extent that Georgism mattered in terms of being a political force, at least for a couple decades, that actually mattered. Because it's not something I remember reading in my history books when I was going through high school and college and kind of reading U.S. history. The simple account of U.S. history you get there doesn't really talk about Henry George very much. But, there were Georgists who got elected as mayors of big cities, and there were Georgists who were important parts of kind of political coalitions in the Democratic Party, especially under Woodrow Wilson. Some of these very prominent followers of Henry George got like cabinet level positions. And I think, again, most people reading this book simply would not have learned that version of history. They would be very surprised by how influential Georgists were for a little while. And partially that's because Georgists have no influence today. Most people have not even heard of it. It is a zero force in modern American politics. So the question that naturally arises out of this is, how and why did Georgism fade so completely from American politics? From being a force that was being courted by both parties, important people were having to court the Georgists and, say, you should vote for me. And there were Georgist mayors and Georgist cabinet members. How did it just disappear?
I think there are a few reasons, one of which is that the Russian Revolution happens and really changes the political spectrum, Marxism seems like the clear alternative to capitalism. There are ways in which, Georgists get tied into a Wilson administration that is seen as disreputable by the 1920s. But more broadly, I think the main reason is that American geography changes. The automobile becomes more prominent, and more Americans move out of cities, and these concerns about rising urban rents cease to be as relevant as they used to be. And then, by the 1930s, the New Deal sort of doubles down on this and really subsidizes home ownership, subsidizes suburbanization, and you have, a transition from idea of intensively using urban land to extensively sprawling out. And so these ideas seem kind of irrelevant, and I think people struggle to understand them, even in a period when, a lot of times urban land ceases to be valuable at all and is underwater. But, the strategy ultimately has its shortcomings. And, Henry George himself noted that we could do, another period of homesteading. We could try to spread back out again. But ultimately, you're going to hit natural limits. And I think in modern America, suburbs have sprawled out as far, if not further, than is practical. You've seen a transition back into cities, and with that, you've seen growing urban rents, and urban land has again become an important axis of inequality.
It's interesting how the course of history kind of goes through like just successive waves of urbanization. And, you can have little retreats, but basically human history is the history of us living more and more and more in cities, almost continuously, almost from like biblical times. The urbanization percentage just kind of keeps going up and up and up. And the whole era of white flight in the suburbs in America is maybe a little divergence from that, but we got back on the path pretty soon.
Yeah, I think that cities serve a vital economic function. And that was, one of the things that, George was very good at highlighting. Because before George, you had all of these ideas about land and rent that he just built on, ideas that were in Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. But the idea was that land was a place where you grew food.
America was so influenced by like the Jeffersonian ideal, right, of like small farmers, and like that's what land is for. That's what democracy is for. Is the ideal society is a bunch of small, landholding farmers.
Yeah, America is profoundly influenced by this idea, and Americans settle in the far west and farm in ways that don't necessarily make a lot of economic sense or practical sense, but represented a certain ideal that they saw as important to democracy. But in a lot of ways, it's a pretty idiosyncratic idea in the history of democracy. I mean, democracy was based on the urban societies of Greece and Rome, at least in the Western tradition. There's not much of a history of rural democracy being a vibrant phenomenon. And Georgists looked back very explicitly to Greece and Rome at a time in which Americans denigrated cities. They called the city the hope of democracy and hoped to model American cities off of ancient Athens.
All right, so we're coming up on time soon. I want to ask the traditional final question that I always ask in this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? And I will start by saying, you should obviously read the book. The book is Land and Liberty, Henry George and the Crafting of Modern Liberalism. It's a fascinating read. You should go pick up the book. But other than your book, if people are interested in this topic and they want to learn more about Henry George and the movement he built, is there anything else you would recommend to them that they should check out?
So amazingly, about 2 weeks within the publication of my book, a guy named Andrew Femister published Land and Liberalism, which is about Henry George in Ireland. Total coincidence. I guess maybe a lot of people are seeing these ideas as more relevant than they used to. But yeah, land and liberalism is another place to see, I think, potentially a very similar narrative about the role of Henry George in the development of liberalism.
And I guess we'll close with just a thought about, what role do you see Georgism having in today's politics? Obviously, today, one of the central features of our economic times is that we're having a housing crisis. Urban land values have skyrocketed and probably will continue to skyrocket because more and more people keep moving into cities. Certainly, the demand for living in cities seems to just be at an all-time high. So are there particular lessons, and this could be an economic lesson or a political lesson, that we can draw from that time period when Georgism was actually a prominent force? What should we take from that period of a couple decades that we could potentially use to help us today, other than just let's tax the value of land? Maybe we take that for granted, but is there any lesson about how we should do that or what we need to keep in mind while we do that for today's world?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. One of which is that the social movement dynamics around land are very different than the ones we might be used to around fights about labor, for example. They're often cross-class. There are entrepreneurs who also have interest in limiting the amount of money they pay for land. They're often broader coalitions, but often they're not as deep because people don't necessarily have the tight affiliation between the question of themselves and land that they would have for occupation, which is one of the reasons why these ideas, which had been around for so many years, only really, I think, became as influential as they did when they were tied to an ideology that really gave them substantive meaning and provided people with a sense of purpose when they fought for them. Another observation is that even though George saw this as a national and international program, by and large it was an urban program. It was something that was fought over within the boundaries of cities because the issues that were raised were primarily urban in character. It didn't go over very well outside of cities, and I think by and large, this is a policy that should be fought over in the urban terrain. And oftentimes when it came to the state level, the focus was exclusively on providing municipalities with independence to establish the type of policies they wanted to. Another observation, which is a little bit ironic considering that George oftentimes critiqued expertise, is that by and large, when the policy went into effect in American cities, it was not by popular vote, but by expert tax assessors. This actually continues to be the case today, where you have, municipalities in Pennsylvania and I think Connecticut that establish some form of land value taxation, largely through the influence of lobbying by tax experts. And so this is a policy that is, very much achievable and has, I think, had demonstrable impact on urban policy, but it's normally one that involves more local and oftentimes more expert-led coalitions.
All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up for the episode. I want to plug the book one more time. It's Land and Liberty by Chris England. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That's the episode. Thanks for listening. If you've got thoughts, questions, comments, you can send them to mailbag@cnliberalism.org. Let us know what we got right, what we got wrong. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2 of our series on Georgism that focuses on modern implementation and how we can make land value taxes happen. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.